Welcome back to Shadows and Crowns. Let me tell you the story of the Black Dinner of 1440, a grim event in Scottish history that partly inspired the infamous Red Wedding in Game of Thrones. In 15th century Scotland, power teetered between the Crown and the mighty Douglas clan. Two young Douglas brothers, barely teenagers, were invited to Edinburgh Castle for what seemed like a gesture of peace. But beneath the feast lay betrayal, and the night would end in fear, murder, and a legend that still echoes today. This is the story of the Black Dinner, a story of youth, of power, and of a night when celebration turned suddenly into silence. Settle in now. You've arrived at a place of rest. Let the day fall away as you settle into stillness. Let me set the scene. It is 1440 in Scotland, and autumn hangs in the air like a silent warning. The land is wild with heather, wind-blown hills dotted with lonely towers, trees already thinning, and overall, the skies are low and leaden, hinting at cold nights to come. The city of Edinburgh, perched on its volcanic crag, dominates the surrounding landscape. Stone ramparts, battlements, narrow closes, alleyways. And the castle, heavy stone built, looming above like a judge. Edinburgh Castle is more than a fortress. It is the heart of power in Scotland. From it you can see the Firth of Forth stretching out, the river's gray waters reflecting sky, the farmland beyond, and the smaller villages that cling to the edges of lords' domains. But despite the view, the castle itself is often cold, even when fires burn in its great halls. Its corridors echo with steps, with whispered words, with the weight of ambition. The king sits within, but the king does not yet fully rule, because the ruler of Scotland is still young, James II, who inherited the crown as a child after his father, James I, was assassinated in 1437. Though he bears the title of king, he is a minor, protected, or perhaps manipulated, by those around him, regents, noble guardians, powerful advisors. The throne is fragile, the power behind it more tangible than the one who sits upon it. In the years leading up to 1440, tensions in the realm have been gathering. The Black Douglases, one of the most powerful noble families, hold vast lands, deep loyalty among the people and retainers, and influence over both politics and warfare. Their wealth rivals that of the crown. Their reputation is of fierce knights, shrewd marriages, alliances, and old grudges. To many, the Douglases are protectors. To others, dangerously powerful rivals. The term Black Douglases refers to a particular branch of the Douglas family that exerted substantial territorial control and influence during this period. In the city below, life continues in uneasy rhythms. Narrow closes, alleys, wind between tall, leaning timber and stone houses. Smoke curls from chimneys, trailing into the evening air. Merchants ring bells, calling their wares: wool, salted fish, bartered grain. Children dart between barrels and carts. Animals are herded in for the night. Church bells toll the hours. Light wanes. People return homes lit by candle or hearth. The air is cold, with a bite of stone and smoke. Yet this daily life carries undercurrents. Every feast, every court, every snowed-in winter castle gathering is shadowed by rumors. Whispers that the crown feels threatened, that powerful lords plot privilege, that words said in taverns or over wine may find ears far from where one expects. The Douglases, particularly the young William, 6th Earl of Douglas, and his younger brother David, are admired for their courtesy, prowess, and youth. but also watched with suspicion. Their lineage is storied, their position formidable. William Douglas was Earl while still very young. Family papers and genealogical records record his lordship over vast territories and his military retinue. As dusk falls on that autumn evening, Edinburgh Castle glows with torchlight. Within its walls, courtiers gather. Tapestries hang heavy on timbered walls. Food is prepared, venison roasted, ale is poured, wine chilled in earthenware vessels. Music may be practiced, laughter heard. The servants move quietly in the shadows. Armor is polished, torches lit. Banners on the walls shift in the draft of corridors. The scent of smoke, of burning peat, of roasting meat. Strong, rich. But beneath all that, under the surface, there is tension. Power in the highlands, power in the lowlands. The uneasy peace between the crown and the great families. There are fears of injustice, of revenge, of rapid changes. After the assassination of James I, the young James II's reign has been a time of regents, of watchful lords, of shifting alliances. Every event is underscored by the possibility that tonight's gathering may not be merely a feast, but something else. The castle's architecture adds to the unease. Heavy walls, narrow windows, staircases that twist and turn upward. Torchlight flickers. Shadows dance across stone arches. In the great hall, long wooden tables stretch down the center. Benches flank them. High ceiling beams span the hall. The floor is flagstone. The acoustics carry sound from one end to another. Hushed conversations, creaking doors. The distant clink of metal, footsteps in corridors. Outside, the wind picks up. Leaves rustle, shutters bang. The voices inside are muffled by walls and doors, but every so often a laughter bursts out, then goes silent. Curtains shift in windows. The people in the burgs, the town below the castle, may hear the church bells late into the night, or sometimes the distant sound of a horn, echoing from a watchtower. Smoke from hearths drifts upward, blending with dust clouds, muting the last golden light of sunset. The young Earl William Douglas, though only in his early teens, is accustomed to attention. His younger brother David, even more so. Both are raised knowing the weight of family honor. They have been trained in arms, in manners, in the management of estates. They know about loyalty, but also about danger. They understand the ways in which courtesy, flattery, treachery, and suspicion often walk side by side. But they are still boys, vulnerable to things older and more cunning than themselves. On this particular evening, word comes that the Earl of Douglas and his brother are invited to dine with the young King James II himself at Edinburgh Castle. The summons is formal. It is accompanied by respectful language. It arrives at the Douglas lands. Retainers gather. Horses are saddled. Their journey north, across moorland, past hills wrapped in mist, is made under overcast skies. The Douglases ride with attendants, banners, the clatter of metal, the creaking of wagons, the smell of leather and horse sweat. The sun, when it peaks, seems pale behind clouds. As they approach Edinburgh, the city walls rise ahead. Guards at the gate peer down at banners unfurled, at riders approaching. The city, normally busy, noisy, grows quiet as dusk turns to evening. Citizens shut their doors. Torches and oil lamps are lit in windows. A chill wind blows down from the rock on which the castle sits. Stone walls cool beneath moonlight. On every gatehouse, shadows stretch long, fortress walls turning black against the dim sky. Inside the castle, The feast is being prepared. Long tables laid out with fine cloth, dishes of spiced meats, rich sauces, ale. Servants hurry in silence, slipping between shadows. Musicians tuning lutes, gathering with soft voices. At the table, the king awaits, as do the courtiers. There is wine. There is ceremony. There is speech of loyalty, of tradition, of fealty. There are toasts, drinks raised to health, to prosperity, to the Douglas family, to the young king. But in the hall, beneath all that, unease flickers. Guests glance at one another. Eyes shift to the banners. Murmurs are quieted. The presence of certain lords, like William Crichton, the Chancellor, and Sir Alexander Livingston, loom over the gathering. These are men who hold power when the king is too young to exercise it fully. These are men with motives, histories, ambition. Some say this dinner may be honor, but others wonder whether it is trap. Crichton and Livingston feature in several chronicles and modern historical retellings as key actors around the Black Dinner, though exact motives remain uncertain. Yet the Douglases accept the summons. To decline would be to offend the court, to risk suspicion, to weaken family honor. So they come, nobles, retainers, horses, banners, into the castle at dusk, passing through portcullis, across drawbridges, up stone stairs, along torchlit corridors. They dismount beneath arches, their armor echoing. They leave their horses and trappings, weapons sheathed. They are invited into warm halls where the air is thick with smoke and roasting meat. The murmur of many voices, low laughter. The light is dim, the shadows flicker. Inside the great hall, the feast begins. Wine cups are filled and passed. Bread is broken. Voices rise in speeches of loyalty. The Douglases, though young, are seated high, honored. They partake in fine dishes, roasted meats, game, spiced sauces. Music plays softly in the background. The color of candlelight, amber flicker, illuminates faces lined by torchlight, by expectation, by anxiety. Outside, the night deepens. The castle walls are quiet, except for the rush of wind and sudden caw of ravens from the battlements. For a moment, it seems a moment of peace, a moment of traditional ceremony, perhaps even friendship between Crown and Douglas. But the shadows press in. The air feels tight. The Douglases, young and proud, feast among men who hold secret power. The king, too young to fully guard himself, listens to the words of advisors, of regents. Guests are careful how they speak. Steps through the hall echo too loud. Tapestries absorb sound. Polished stone reflects torchlight. Swords at shoulders, daggers at belts. Not visible, but present in tension. And so the scene ends on the brink, on the edge of wine, of song, of chamber laughter. That this evening they dine together as though there is unity, honor, loyalty. But beneath every rich plate, every toast, every glinting goblet is suspicion. Beneath every candlelight glimmer, the promise of betrayal. For in the heart of Edinburgh Castle, under flickering torches and ancient stones, history is preparing to remember a night that will be whispered for centuries, a night when a feast will feel like farewell. The name of Douglas was already legend when William, the 6th Earl, came of age. For generation it had echoed in Scotland's fields of battle, whispered in courts, etched into charters and treaties. To be a Douglas was to inherit not just land and titles, but a mythic place in the fabric of the realm. The family's crest carried the heart of Bruce, the literal, embalmed heart of Robert the Bruce, carried by James the Good Douglas to Spain in a doomed attempt to bring it against the Moors in battle. That tale alone wove the Douglases into the story of Scotland's freedom. To many, they were the protectors of independence, men of valor who bled for a crown and a country. To others, they were rivals so mighty that even kings must look upon them with unease. By the early 15th century, the family had become more than a household. They were a dynasty. Vast estates stretched from the borders into the lowlands. Fortresses stood like watchtowers of ambition, and their retainers numbered in the thousands. Their alliances through marriage gave them ties to other great houses. Their coffers brimmed with revenues drawn from rents, farms, and trade. Their armies, when called upon, could rival those mustered by the king himself. In this balance lay the seed of admiration and of fear. For when a noble's power matches that of the crown, loyalty becomes a question not of obligation, but of convenience. Still, the Black Douglases had shown themselves capable of both service and defiance. They had fought in France during the 100 Years' War, their banners carried alongside those of the French crown. They had stood in Scotland's own wars, clashing with English raiders and defending the borders. Yet they had also tested the limits of royal patience, pressing claims, demanding rights, reminding monarchs that the throne did not stand alone. Such was the family legacy that fell into the hands of a boy of 16. William Douglas, the 6th Earl, was still in the raw edge of youth when fate placed the mantle of leadership upon him. 16 years old, tall, dark-haired by most accounts, and said to have carried himself with the easy grace of a noble born to command. But for all the weight he bore, he was still unseasoned, more youth than man. He had known the training fields, the language of falcons, the ceremony of courts, but not yet the full bitterness of power. At his side was his younger brother David, close in age, shadowing him with the innocence of a boy not yet burdened with decisions. Together, the two were symbols of continuity, of lineage, of the unstoppable inheritance of Douglas strength. Imagine them riding into a town, banners fluttering above their retinue, the people craning their necks to see the young lords. Children, really, but clothed in velvet, mounted on horses draped in colors, surrounded by knights sworn to their house. To peasants in the fields, they must have seemed like figures from legend reborn, the descendants of the warriors who had fought alongside Bruce. Their names alone carried weight. Their faces, still soft with youth, belied the storm they represented in politics. And here was the contradiction. They were admired, even adored, for their lineage, their courage, their promise. But they were also feared. For a boy lord who inherits such power is not merely a nobleman. He is a potential rival. A Douglas of 16 might live to wield armies against the throne. A Douglas of 16 might forge alliances that cut the crown's authority in half. And a Douglas of 16, untested and perhaps reckless, might not yet understand the delicate balances that kept the realm together. Yet when William and David appeared in Edinburgh, they were not warriors of ambition. They were children, stepping into a game whose rules were older than they were. A game played by men decades their senior. Their father had died. Their family expected of them what it had expected of every Douglas: to carry the name with strength, to guard their lands, to show loyalty to Scotland, to protect their kin. But behind every expectation was the reality. Two teenagers walking into the lion's den. One can imagine William trying to strike the balance. Shoulders squared, words chosen carefully, a voice still finding its manhood. He would have known the weight of eyes upon him, of advisors watching every gesture, every phrase. His younger brother David, perhaps more careless, laughing too easily, speaking with less caution, betraying their youth in ways that made them more sympathetic and more vulnerable. The Douglas lineage behind them was filled with men hardened by war and politics. James the Black Douglas, companion of Robert the Bruce, had died in combat carrying Bruce's heart. The third Earl, Archibald the Grim, had been a formidable lord, securing the Douglas inheritance and shaping it into one of the strongest houses in Scotland. By the time William inherited the title, the Douglases controlled such vast wealth and manpower that foreign courts recognized them as forces in their own right. These were not minor nobles bowing humbly to a child king. They were lords whose ancestors had often stood as equals to monarchs. And now that history lived in the hands of two boys who may have looked across the tables of Edinburgh Castle and seen men twice or three times their age, men who spoke in half-truths and played games of alliance and betrayal. It is difficult not to feel sympathy for them. However proud they were, however strong their retainers, however noble their name, they were still teenagers, their world shaped by others. Imagine the weight of inheritance pressing on William's shoulders. At 16, most young men dream of jousts, of hunting in forests, of courtly dances. William's dreams could not have been so simple. Every ride, every feast, every audience carried political consequence. His every word might be reported, twisted, interpreted as ambition or treason. Every friend was a potential rival, every toast a test. And yet, he was still a boy who perhaps longed for camaraderie, laughter, the simple joys of life not yet soured by power. David, younger still, carried less responsibility, but no less danger. The younger brothers of powerful lords often became pawns, married off, sent as hostages, used as leverage. His presence at Edinburgh was both a privilege and a peril. He was there to show the family's loyalty, to accompany his elder brother, but also to serve as a reminder that the Douglases were many, their bloodline strong, their heirs secure. For a crown anxious of rivals, that reminder could not be comforting. To the common people, the Douglas brothers must have seemed almost like storybook figures. Their youth softened their image, their lineage elevated it. They represented Scotland's knightly past and its uncertain future. To their allies, they were hope. To their enemies, threat. To the boy, King James II, perhaps, they were both. Companions of youth, but also dangerous shadows stretching across his throne. And so, as they rode into Edinburgh, as they crossed the cobbled streets and passed beneath the looming gates of the castle, they bore upon their shoulders centuries of expectation, suspicion, and fear. They were two young men admired for their charm and presence, feared for their heritage, and ultimately trapped by forces beyond their control. In that autumn of 1440, William and David were not merely guests of a royal feast. They were symbols of all that was noble and dangerous in Scotland's fractured realm. And as the torches flickered in the great hall, as the tables were laid, as the musicians tuned their instruments, the Douglas brothers stepped into history. They could not know it, but their youth and their legacy would make them unforgettable, not for the lives they lived, but for the way those lives ended. The autumn winds had shifted when the summons came. It was not unusual for noble families to be called to the royal court, especially those of rank and influence. But in the case of the Black Douglases, each message from the crown carried more weight than parchment could bear. The messenger would have ridden hard, cloak whipping in the wind, hooves beating the roads that cut through Douglas lands. In his satchel, sealed with wax and marked with the authority of the crown, was an invitation or a command, depending on how one read it. William Douglas, the young 6th Earl, and his brother David were to attend the king at Edinburgh Castle to dine with his grace and his guardians. On the surface, the message spoke of ceremony, of fellowship, of strengthening bonds between the throne and its greatest vassals. Such invitations were dressed always in the velvet of courtesy, adorned with the proper flourishes. But everyone in Scotland understood that such words could mean more than they said. A feast could be friendship. A feast could be suspicion. And sometimes, a feast could be death. William must have read the summons with careful eyes, tracing the elegant strokes of the script, weighing every phrase. His counselors would have looked over his shoulder, murmuring their interpretations. Some may have urged caution, decline politely, plead distance or illness. Others would have insisted on acceptance. After all, what signal would it send if the Douglases refused? Refusal could be seen as arrogance, or worse, treason. So the decision was made. They would go. To decline was to insult the king, to risk drawing suspicion where none yet might rest. To accept was to show loyalty, to appear confident, to play the role expected of them. Perhaps William even believed that his presence, his courtesy, his youth would prove his family's fealty. Perhaps he thought the feast would indeed be what it seemed, a gathering of nobles around their king. Preparations began at once. Horses were saddled, retainers summoned, clothes chosen. The Douglases were a house of immense pride, and their heirs would not ride to Edinburgh in anything less than full dignity. Velvet cloaks lined with fur, fine boots polished, swords at their sides, though not the full armor of war, for this was a journey of court, not battle. Their retinue would ride with them, banners fluttering in the cool wind. The black Douglas heart emblazoned for all to see. The journey itself stretched across moorland and valley, the air crisp, the days shortening. The rhythm of hooves on earth, the creak of saddles, the low chatter of men as they rode. Fields lay fallow after harvest, their stubble golden against the gray sky. Forests loomed dark, their leaves thinning, the ground beneath them carpeted with damp decay. Villages watched the procession pass, children staring wide-eyed, women pausing from chores, men bowing stiffly at the sight of such grandeur. For many, the young Douglases were symbols of continuity, figures both admired and feared. At night, when the company stopped to rest, fires were lit, meals taken in the glow of flame. Retainers joked, perhaps sang, though always with glances cast at their young lords. William might have withdrawn, speaking softly with his most trusted men, while David, less cautious, laughed more easily, eager for the novelty of the journey. Above them, the stars stretched clear and sharp, the breath of horses steaming in the cold. The roads to Edinburgh were well traveled, yet every traveler knew the dangers: bandits, sudden storms, and the greater unseen dangers of politics waiting at journey's end. As they drew closer to the city, the landscape grew busier. Farmsteads, mills, the faint spire of churches rising in the distance. Edinburgh itself appeared suddenly, like a stone crown upon the land. The castle loomed first, rising sheer from its volcanic rock, its walls blackened with age, its towers bristling. Below it, the burg sprawled in crooked streets and alleys, smoke rising from countless chimneys. the air thick with the smell of cooking fires and refuse. For William and David, entering Edinburgh must have been both awe-inspiring and daunting. The city was alive with noise, merchants crying their wares, smiths hammering at forges, children darting between carts. Yet as the Douglas Company passed, voices hushed, eyes followed. The power, Homayr, of the Douglases was not invisible. It rode into the city with them, in the banners that snapped in the wind, in the polished armor of their guards, in the youth and pride of their lords. The climb to the castle was steep, the cobbled road winding upward, lined with stone houses and the murmurs of onlookers. At the gate, guards stood stiff and armed, halberds in hand, eyes measuring the approach. Trumpets may have sounded, or bells rung, as the Douglases entered. The portcullis rose, chains rattling, and the procession passed into the shadow of the fortress. Inside, torches burned against the gathering dusk. Courtiers awaited them, bowing with the practiced elegance of men who concealed their thoughts behind polished faces. Words of welcome were spoken, formalities exchanged. The brothers were led through halls where tapestries hung heavy, and the air smelled of stone and smoke. The sound of footsteps echoed against the flagstones. Voices carried strangely beneath the vaulted ceilings. Perhaps William felt pride stepping into the presence of the king. Perhaps he thought himself secure, honored to sit at the royal table. Perhaps David's eyes roamed wide, drinking in the splendor, oblivious to the undercurrents. Or perhaps deep within, they both felt a chill, an unease they could not name. The summons had been answered. The Douglases were within the walls of Edinburgh Castle. The feast awaited, and though no shadow yet fell across the table, history already knew what they did not, that this journey would not end as it began. The night was heavy with smoke and expectation. Edinburgh Castle, perched high on its rock, had been prepared for ceremony. Courtiers and retainers, servants and guards, all knew the weight of this gathering. The king was still a boy, but the hall that night belonged to men whose ambitions reached further than his years. For the young Douglases, William and David, this was to be an honor, a gesture of welcome, an assurance of loyalty between crown and house. At least, so the feast was meant to appear. The great hall itself was a marvel of medieval power. Long and high, its ceiling beams darkened by centuries of smoke. It echoed with the soft rustle of movement. Tapestries hung along the walls, scenes of hunting, of saints, of battles long past, woven in bright colors that flickered in the torchlight. The floor was flagstone, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, and on it stood long wooden tables set with vessels of pewter and silver, polished to a dull shine. Banners bearing royal emblems and noble arms hung between torches, their colors muted by shadow. At the center of the hall, beneath the largest hearth where logs roared and spit sparks into the air, stood the high table. Upon it lay plates of roasted meats, venison glazed with honey, boar seasoned with herbs, great bowls of stewed fruits spiced with cinnamon and cloves. Loaves of fresh bread, their crusts crackling, were piled in baskets. Earthen pitchers brimmed with ale and wine, their scents mingling with the smoke to create an atmosphere both rich and stifling. For the guests who entered, the abundance was meant to inspire awe, to remind them that this was the seat of kingship, a place of both hospitality and authority. William Douglas, only 16, must have stepped into that hall with a blend of pride and apprehension. At his side, his younger brother David, bright-eyed, curious, perhaps less cautious. Behind them, their retainers and attendants, dressed with dignity but subdued, for the true spectacle belonged to the lords at the high table. As the brothers walked forward, voices quieted, eyes followed. Youth they may have been, but they carried the name of Douglas, and with it, the weight of power. The boy, King James II, was present, seated among his advisors. Still only 10 years old, his cheeks flushed with youth, his gaze curious and uncertain. He had been taught the forms of courtesy, the gestures of kingship. But his reign was held in the hands of older men, William Crichton, the Chancellor, and Sir Alexander Livingston, among others. They hovered like shadows, their presence felt even when they spoke little. To the young king, the Douglases may have been companions of age, familiar in their youth. To his guardians, they were something else entirely. When William and David were ushered to their seats high upon the dais, the hall filled with sound again. Musicians in the gallery plucked lutes and fiddles, their notes weaving a soft backdrop to conversation. Servants moved quickly, filling cups with wine, laying dishes upon the table. The feast began in earnest. Voices rose, laughter followed, the sound of knives on plates echoed. To any outsider, it would have seemed a celebration, a demonstration of unity, of prosperity, of tradition. The food itself was plentiful, almost overwhelming. Platters of roasted swan and goose, their skins crisp and golden. Pies filled with rabbit and herbs. Dishes of fish drawn from the firth, seasoned with saffron and pepper. Rare spices brought from distant ports. Trenchers of bread served as plates, soaking up juices before being discarded. Sweetmeats appeared between courses, almonds candied, fruit stewed in honey. Each dish was a performance meant to dazzle, to remind guests of the wealth and reach of the crown. And yet, beneath the laughter and the music, a different rhythm beat. Conversations hushed when the Douglases spoke. Eyes watched their movements, their gestures. Every word they offered in courtesy was weighed by those who listened. Did William speak too confidently? Did David laugh too freely? Were their manners humble enough? Or did they betray pride? These were questions that filled the silence between words, questions that mattered more than the food or the music. William, conscious of his youth, likely tried to carry himself with dignity. His words measured, his posture straight, his voice controlled. He would have raised his cup to toast the king, to honor the realm, to declare his loyalty. And David, less guarded, may have added a note of levity, drawing smiles from some and frowns from others. They were boys at a man's table, navigating a world of subtleties they had not yet mastered. For the courtiers, the feast was theater. Each dish, each song, each toast was part of a script, one that balanced welcome with watchfulness. Servants moved silently, their eyes lowered, but they too felt the tension in the hall. They poured wine with careful hands, carried platters without meeting gazes, but in their silence they bore witness. They would remember the way laughter broke too quickly, the way certain lords whispered together, the way the boy king's eyes shifted from his companions to his guardians, as though he knew there was more beneath the surface. The atmosphere thickened as the night wore on. The fires roared louder, the air grew hotter, the scents more cloying. Wine loosened tongues, laughter became sharper, but still unease lingered. The feast felt almost too deliberate, too carefully arranged. The Douglases were honored, yes, but perhaps honored too much. Their every gesture mirrored by courtesy, too pointed to be natural. It was as if the entire hall were waiting. For what? No one could say aloud. Imagine the flicker of torchlight on William's face, the shadows deepening in his eyes, Imagine David leaning close, whispering some jest, trying to ease the tension. Imagine the boy king, his hand small upon the table, watching the young Douglases with the curiosity of a child and the unease of one who senses danger without understanding its shape. And above them all, the great tapestries swayed slightly in the draught, their woven hunts and battles frozen in eternal silence, while the real hunt, the real battle, unfolded unseen in the hearts of men. The musicians played on. The courses continued. The hall, to any ear untrained, would have seemed full of joy, but beneath it the feast was not joy, it was judgment in disguise. And though the young Douglases laughed, ate, and drank, they were already moving toward a moment from which there would be no return. For now, however, the evening pressed forward. Servants cleared dishes, poured more wine, laid new courses upon the table. Voices rose again, toasts were made, the hall filled with the sound of knives cutting meat, of cups clinking together. The Douglases, guests of honor, sat high at the table, basking in a ceremony that seemed grand, even generous. And yet, as the torches burned lower and the shadows grew deeper, the feast felt less like celebration and more like a stage waiting for its final act. The brothers could not know it, but history would remember this night not for its music or its dishes, but for what was about to follow. The feast would not end in laughter, nor in toasts, but in silence and dread. But in this moment, in the heart of the hall, the food still glimmered, the wine still flowed, and the music still played. The black dinner had begun. The hall had grown hot with the heat of bodies, the blaze of torches, and the constant roaring of the great hearth. The feast stretched on into the night, each course richer and heavier than the last. Silver goblets caught the flicker of flame, spilling red wine into shadows. Laughter rose, but never too high, as though restrained by invisible hands. The musicians plucked their strings, played their pipes, filled the gaps between conversations with melodies designed to soften unease. The Douglases, William and his younger brother David, still sat at the high table, honored guests before their boy king. Their cups had been filled again and again, their plates set with delicacies few could dream of tasting. To any eye, they were celebrated, wrapped in courtesy. To any ear, they were welcomed with honor. But beneath it all, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The torches hissed as sap bled from the wood, smoke curling upward to gather along the beams. The air was thick, thick with the smell of roasting meat and spilled wine, thick with the murmurs of watchful men, thick with a weight that pressed down on the chest. Some of the courtiers shifted on their benches, restless. Others cast glances toward the doors as though expecting something. The servants moved slower now, their trays heavy, their eyes lowered. But they too seemed to sense the coming turn. At last, when the feast seemed to have reached its height, when laughter had grown thin, when the hall felt both overfull and hollow, there came a sound that stilled the room. Boots upon stone, measured, heavy, echoing. From the far end of the hall, through the great doors, came men not carrying platters of food or pitchers of wine, but something else entirely. They moved with purpose, their steps deliberate. The conversations faltered. The music, sensing the shift, stumbled into silence. In their hands, they bore a single object, large, dark, shrouded in cloth. They carried it not as one carries a gift, but as one carries a burden. When they reached the high table, they set it down with a thud that rattled the goblets, that drew every eye. The cloth was pulled back. There upon the table, before the young Douglases, lay the head of a black bull. Its eyes were glazed, its horns curved like scythes, its tongue lolling dark against its teeth. The flesh was raw, the smell of blood faint but unmistakable. In the flickering torchlight, it seemed both real and unreal, as though it had stepped from a nightmare into the world of men. For a moment, silence held. The hall froze, suspended in horror. The meaning was unmistakable. In Scottish tradition, the head of a black bull was the omen of death, the symbol of condemnation. It was not a jest, not a flourish, not some strange course of meat. It was a sentence, a warning, a prophecy made flesh upon the table. William Douglas, barely 16, stared at it. Perhaps his breath caught in his throat, his hand tightening around the stem of his goblet. Perhaps David, younger and less guarded, turned first in confusion, then in dawning fear. Around them, courtiers shifted, some pale, some grim, a few, perhaps, hiding satisfaction. The boy king, James II, no more than 10, was said to have wept, realizing too late the cruelty unfolding before his eyes. The torches cracked, sparks spat upward, the hall seemed to darken around that single object. The bull's head was not merely flesh, it was judgment. With it, the feast was over, and the mask of courtesy dropped. Men rose from their benches, their chairs, scraping loudly against stone. Words were spoken, sharp and cold, though history does not preserve them all. Some accounts say that William Crichton, the Chancellor, accused the Douglases of treason, of plotting against the king, of wielding too much power. Others claim the charges were vague, unspoken, for none were truly needed. The symbol itself declared guilt. The Douglas brothers were seized. Hands fell upon their shoulders, upon their arms, dragging them from their seats. The goblets toppled, spilling red wine across the table, pulling near the bull's head, as though it drank blood still. David cried out, whether in anger, fear, or protest, no one can know. William, taller, older, may have struggled, may have demanded to be heard. But against the grip of seasoned men, against the weight of conspiracy, their strength was nothing. The hall erupted in murmurs, the courtiers standing, leaning, whispering. The musicians shrank back into the gallery, their instruments silent. Servants pressed against the walls, eyes wide, unsure whether to flee or to stay. The boy king is said to have cried, pleading for their lives, his voice thin and desperate against the storm. But the regents, the men who ruled in his stead, did not falter. Their decision had been made long before this night. The Douglases were dragged from the high table, their chairs left empty, the bull's head leering in the torchlight. Their footsteps echoed as they were taken across the hall, through the doors, into the cold stone corridors beyond. Behind them, the feast lay ruined, the laughter silenced, the pretense stripped bare. For William and David, the world must have shifted in that instant. A moment before, they were honored guests, heirs of a dynasty, young men feasting in a king's hall. Now they were prisoners, condemned, marked for death by a symbol older than themselves. The weight of their family's history, their youth, their pride, all collapsed beneath the raw truth of betrayal. The courtiers remained, stunned. Some may have looked down, unwilling to meet one another's eyes. Some may have whispered approval. Others, perhaps, felt guilt gnaw at them, but dared not speak. For in that hall, to oppose the judgment was to invite suspicion, perhaps even to share the brothers' fate. And so silence held, broken only by the crackle of fire and the drip of spilled wine from the edge of the table. The bull's head remained where it had been placed, a grim centerpiece. Its presence was grotesque but symbolic. It declared what no man dared say aloud. The Douglases, however noble, however young, however admired, were too great a threat to live. And so the black dinner earned its name, not from the abundance of food, not from the music or the torches, but from this moment. The black bull's head upon the table, the omen of death presented as course, as verdict, as ritual. The night did not end there. The Douglases were not slain in the hall itself, for even betrayal carried its forms. They were taken away, to be held until judgment was complete, until the pretense of trial or sentence could be passed. But in truth, the decision had already been sealed, the omen already delivered. The feast had only been the stage. The bull's head had been the curtain rising. In that moment, the young lords of Douglas ceased to be heirs. They became martyrs, figures destined for tragedy, their youth forever bound to the image of the feast turned funeral. And the hall, once filled with laughter and music, now felt hollow. The courtiers, the regents, even the boy king, sat beneath the flicker of torches with the smell of blood in their nostrils, the symbol of death upon their table, and the knowledge that Scotland had crossed a line it could not uncross. The feast was over. The omen had been given. The black dinner had shown its true face. The black bull's head had spoken more loudly than any words. Its glassy eyes and lolling tongue declared the verdict, and the feast, with all its lavish dishes and music, was revealed for what it was, a prelude to death. William Douglas, Earl at 16, and his younger brother David were torn from their seats, dragged from the high table where only moments before they had been honored. Their cries echoed briefly in the hall before the great doors closed behind them, leaving the courtiers in a silence thick as smoke. The fire still roared, the torches still burned, but the hall felt hollow, its warmth curdled into dread. The boy king, James II, sat stricken, his cheeks wet, powerless to intervene. His voice may have pleaded, but his guardians, William Crichton, the Chancellor, and Sir Alexander Livingston, had already set their course. The brothers were taken through narrow corridors, the chill of stone closing around them. Gone was the heat of the feast, the smell of roasted meat, the music of lutes. Here the air was damp, smelling of dust and old mortar, of iron from hinges and bolts. Their footsteps echoed against flagstones as guards marched them toward the courtyard. Perhaps William struggled, demanding his rights as Earl, insisting on trial by law, his voice shaking but proud. Perhaps David, still barely more than a boy, cried out in fear or disbelief, clinging to his brother's arm. History does not preserve their words, but it does not need to. The silence of what followed speaks loudly enough. At last they emerged into the night. The courtyard of Edinburgh Castle lay open to the cold sky. Torches flared against the walls, their flames whipped by the wind. Shadows stretched across cobblestones, long and wavering. Above them, the towers of the castle rose black against the stars, grim witnesses to what would unfold. The night was still, broken only by the crackle of flame and the murmur of guards. The Douglases were brought to the center, surrounded by men with hard eyes and unspeaking mouths. No crowd of townsfolk was present, No clamoring witnesses. This was not a spectacle for the people, but a ritual of power conducted within stone walls. The air carried the metallic tang of fear, the weight of inevitability. In some accounts, a formal accusation was made that William and David plotted treason, that their family's power overshadowed the king, that their loyalty was false. But whether words were spoken or not, the outcome was already known. The Black Bull's head had served as the judgment. This was only the execution of its sentence. The brothers were given no time to plead, no advocate to defend them. They stood alone, boys against men, heirs against guardians, life against death. William, 16, must have tried to hold his head high to show the dignity of his line. He bore not only his own fate, but the weight of the Douglas name, the expectations of generations. In his last moments, he may have remembered his father, his grandfather, the long line of warriors and lords who had carried the family banner into battle. He may have thought of his lands, his people, his retainers, who would never again look to him. David, younger, perhaps no more than 12 or 13, may have faltered. His eyes wide, his voice breaking, his hand searching for his brothers. He had been raised in privilege, in promise, never imagining his life would end here, beneath the torches of the castle yard, condemned by men older than his years and hungrier than his ambitions. The executioner stepped forward. His face was shadowed by the flicker of torchlight, his axe gleaming cold in the night. The brothers were led to the block, rough wood darkened by use. The sound of the crowd was absent. Only the wind, the fire, and the shifting of armored guards filled the air. William was forced down first. Perhaps he knelt of his own accord, refusing to show fear. Perhaps he spoke words of defiance, of loyalty, of protest. But the night swallowed them, leaving only the memory of his youth. The axe was raised, glinting briefly in the torchlight. Then it fell. The sound was dull, final. His head was lifted, his body crumpled, and a silence heavier than any before settled over the courtyard. David was next. He had watched, and now it was his turn. He may have wept, may have struggled, may have whispered his brother's name. The guards held him fast. He was led to the block, his small frame dwarfed by the rough wood. The executioner raised the axe again. When it fell, the echoes seemed to reverberate across the castle walls, across the city below, across the years that would follow. Two boys, heirs of one of Scotland's greatest families, had been struck down in the heart of the royal castle, beneath the watch of their king. Their bodies lay still upon the cobblestones, their blood seeping into the cracks between stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The torches sputtered in the wind, the flames bending as though recoiling from the sight. The guards shifted uneasily, some perhaps crossing themselves, others looking away. Even hardened men felt the weight of what had been done. The regents, Crichton, Livingston, had achieved their aim. The power of the Black Douglases had been broken, at least for a time. But they had also written a story that would echo across history. For in killing children, they had not merely removed rivals. They had stained their names with betrayal, with the image of a feast turned into a funeral, with the symbol of a black bull's head that would never be forgotten. The boy, King James II, is said to have been inconsolable, his tears falling even as the heads of his companions were taken away, Whether he understood the necessity, whether he approved or not, does not matter. He was a child, and the men who ruled in his name had shown him the cruelty of power. The memory would remain with him, shaping his reign, hardening him into a man who would one day rule in his own right, with both strength and ruthlessness. That night, the feast ended in silence. The courtiers returned to their chambers, their laughter gone, their stomachs heavy with food that now tasted like ashes. The musicians packed their instruments, their strings still humming faintly in the dark. The servants cleared the tables, the bull's head removed, the wine spilled across the boards. The torches burned low, casting long shadows against the stone, shadows that seemed to carry whispers of the young lord's voices. In the courtyard, the stones held their memory. The wind blew cold. The stars looked down indifferent. And the walls of the castle absorbed the cries, the thud of the axe, the silence that followed. Stone remembers. And those stones would carry the weight of that night long after the men who ordered it had turned to dust. Thus ended the lives of William and David Douglas, youths cut down in betrayal, symbols of power turned victims of politics. Their deaths would ignite feuds, would deepen divisions, would shape the course of Scotland's history. But in that moment, in the torchlit yard of Edinburgh Castle, they were only boys. Boys whose lives had been taken by the hunger of men. Boys whose innocence had been sacrificed to ambition. Boys whose names would never again be spoken without recalling the Black Dinner. And so the night closed over them. The flames guttered low. The torches hissed in the wind. The castle stood silent, its stones dark against the sky, and within its silence, the echoes of execution lingered, a memory that would haunt the realm for centuries. The Black Dinner was complete. The courtyard of Edinburgh Castle grew quiet after the last echo of the axe faded into night. The torches hissed, the wind swept cold across the stones, and 2 young lives lay ended. But though William and David Douglas were gone, the story of their betrayal had only begun its journey. History, like stone, remembers, and the memory of the Black Dinner would not fade with the dawn. In the weeks that followed, word spread across Scotland. Messengers carried the news along the roads, into the glens, across the borders where Douglas banners had flown for generations. The people heard, and their reactions were mixed. Fear, outrage, grief. To the Douglas retainers, the murder of their young lords was not merely a political act. It was a wound, deep and personal. They had sworn loyalty to their house, and now its heirs had been cut down not in battle, but under the guise of hospitality. Betrayal stung more sharply than any sword. The family itself reeled. The Black Douglases were powerful still, their lands vast, their allies many. But the deaths of William and David at such tender ages sent shockwaves through their kin. Their uncle, James the Gross, inherited the earldom, a man older and less beloved, but cunning and determined. Under his leadership, the Douglas power endured. Yet even as he consolidated, the story of the feast darkened the family's name and fueled feuds that would smolder for decades. Politically, the Black Dinner had achieved its short-term aim. Chancellor Crichton and Sir Alexander Livingston had demonstrated that no noble, however powerful, stood beyond the reach of the crown, or more accurately, beyond the reach of those who controlled it. By executing the Douglas heirs, they curbed the immediate threat of Douglas dominance. But in doing so, they also deepened divisions within the kingdom. Nobles looked on with unease, knowing that loyalty was no shield against suspicion, that even the most honored guests could find themselves condemned. Trust in the crown's guardians eroded, replaced by fear. For the young king, James II, the memory was seared into his childhood. Chronicles tell us he wept as the Douglases were dragged away, powerless to stop what unfolded in his name. He would grow into a man marked by this lesson. That power demanded ruthlessness, that mercy could be weakness, that a king must command or be commanded. In later years, James II would take up arms against the Douglases himself, leading to bloody confrontations that echoed the first betrayal he had witnessed as a child. But beyond politics, beyond the strategies of men in high halls, the Black Dinner sank into legend. Its imagery was unforgettable. The long tables, the torchlight, the music stilled. The black bull's head thudded upon the boards. The omen of death unveiled in the midst of feast. It was a scene so vivid, so theatrical, that it passed into memory as more than history. It became story, a tale retold around hearths in taverns, in whispered warnings of treachery cloaked in courtesy. For centuries, Scottish folklore held it close. Parents told their children of the night the Douglases were slain in Edinburgh Castle, cautioning them that power can be dangerous, that pride invites peril, that even feasts may hide knives. Writers and poets took up the theme, weaving it into the fabric of Scotland's tragic past. Chroniclers recorded it with varying detail, some embellishing, some stripping away, but always keeping the image of the bull's head at the center. The omen that turned celebration into death. The bull itself carried weight in Scottish symbolism. Strong, untamed, dark in its presence. It had long represented ferocity and fate. To place its severed whole head upon the table was not merely to deliver a message. It was to summon all the ancient weight of ritual. To cloak the execution in the guise of inevitability. It was as though the brothers had not been condemned by men, but by fate itself. Such imagery is powerful, and it is why the story lingered. And linger it did. The feud between the Crown and the Black Douglases flared and faded, sometimes through alliances, sometimes through bloodshed. Later generations would continue the struggle, their loyalty shifting, their rebellion rekindling. But always in the background, the memory of the Black Dinner haunted them. It was the moment when trust had been broken, when innocence had been slain, when the game of power revealed its most merciless face. As centuries passed, the Black Dinner took on a life beyond history. It became a parable of betrayal, a warning cloaked in ritual. In the modern age, writers and creators looked back to it, finding in its stark imagery the seeds of drama. George R.R. Martin, author of A Song of Ice and Fire, drew upon it when crafting the infamous Red Wedding, a fictional feast where hospitality is betrayed, where a family is slaughtered at the table, where the symbol of food and drink is twisted into death. The echoes are unmistakable. The guests honored, the feast lavish, the doors closed, the betrayal sudden. The Black Dinner of 1440 had become part of the cultural imagination, centuries later still casting its shadow. But while fiction carries it into new realms, the truth remains more haunting. For the victims were not warriors in battle, but children. 16-year-old William, carrying the name of his ancestors but still untested by life. David, younger still, a boy with laughter still in his voice. Their lives ended not with swords in hand upon a field of honor, but beneath the cold stare of torches in a courtyard, condemned by a symbol placed upon a table. This is why the story endures, not merely for its drama, but for its tragedy. Edinburgh Castle still stands upon its rock, its walls weathered by centuries, its halls echoing with the footsteps of countless generations. Visitors walk through its rooms, gaze upon its great hall, stand in its courtyards. Many know the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, or of sieges and wars, but some still pause to remember the Black Dinner, to picture the long tables lit by torchlight, the musicians silenced, the black bull's head thudding upon the boards. They imagine the young Douglases dragged away, the boy king's tears, the courtyard heavy with execution. They remember that history is not only battles won and treaties signed, but feasts that turn to funerals. For history is a chain, and the Black Dinner is one of its darkest links. It teaches that power, unchecked, devours even the young. It teaches that betrayal often wears the mask of honor. And it teaches that stories once written in blood do not vanish. They echo. The echoes reach us even now. In the quiet of night, in the telling of tales, in the pages of books, in the scripts of drama, the Black Dinner returns. It reminds us that human ambition, human fear, and human cruelty are not bound by centuries. They live on, repeating, reshaping, reminding us that the past is never wholly gone. And so, as the torches gutter low, and the castle walls fade back into shadow, we close this tale. The young Douglases are gone, the feast has ended, the omen has been fulfilled. But their story lingers, in the stones of Edinburgh, in the memory of Scotland, in the imagination of all who hear it. This was the Black Dinner of 1440, a feast turned funeral, a symbol turned sentence, a betrayal so deep that even now, 6 centuries later, we still hear its echoes. And so we leave Edinburgh Castle, its torches long extinguished, its stones still carrying the memory of that night. The Black Dinner has passed into legend, but its echoes remind us that history is not only victories and crowns, but also the silence after betrayal and the shadows that linger long after the feast. Thank you for joining me tonight, here in Shadows and Crowns. Rest now, let the story fade into dream, and may your sleep be gentle and your night quiet.